My next and last speaker is Dr. Christopher Davidson, who is a colleague at RUSI, I discovered the other day, as an associate fellow.
I discovered that too.
Exactly. And is an academic, a reader in government at Durham University. As I said, his recent book is Why, After the Sheikhs, Why Gulf Monarchies Will Fail. And when you talk about the context of the Arab Spring, we saw Bahrain come into the radar very quickly, but yet the Bahrain regime is still there, and the monarchies of not just the Gulf but perhaps the Arab world are very much firmly in power. So it would be good to get that monarchy angle from this analysis as we conclude. Chris.
Many thanks. Thanks to the organisers, RTS and Oxford Union, for hosting this great event. I'm slightly frustrated I can't be taking part in the live tweeting as well. I can assure you if I had my iPad in front of me, I'd be doing that one-handed as well. Yes, as mentioned, turning our attention to another part of the Middle East, to the 6 Gulf monarchies. These are often lumped together in one group. They are quite different to each other. We have very differing population sizes. Saudi Arabia's a pretty large country. We have some fantastically small, wealthy countries with the highest GDP per capita in the world, such as Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. We have Kuwait that has nearly 50 years of parliamentary experience and activity having taken place. We have very different state formation processes that have underpinned these states. Some were part of the British Empire right up until 1971. Others, Saudi Arabia, had a more autonomous state formation process forged out of an alliance between religious leadership and the tribal muscle provided by the Al Saud dynasty all those centuries ago. Nonetheless, we can make a few important generalizations and identify some patterns here. More or less, they do now seem to constitute this counter-revolutionary bloc in the Arab world. It's very confusing to study this because on the surface it doesn't make much sense. We have Qatar's Al Jazeera network that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which has been cited in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya as actually assisting and helping propel their revolutions. We also see Saudi Arabia and Qatar actually funding and perhaps even arming the rebels in Syria, which is clearly the current front line in the Arab Spring. So on the surface it doesn't make much sense, but when we start to look at it a little bit more in depth, we understand why essentially these 6 fairly traditional Gulf monarchies are probably going to do everything in their powers and use their resources to the maximum to try and resist any meaningful political reform, let alone insurgency or revolution over the next few years. That said, as I'll speak a little bit about today, we do have signs, the cracks are appearing, and we do have a particular manifestation of the Arab Spring already taking place in these Gulf monarchies. It's important, though, as I tried to explain in my book, that we don't get carried away with predictions of Arab Spring in the Gulf monarchies. Many eminent scholars have tried to do that before and have come unstuck. If we go back to the 1960s and 1970s, for example, we had fairly seminal texts at the time predicting that there'd be social change in the region which would inevitably lead to political change. Fred Halliday's Arabia Without Sultans always sticks in my mind, published in the early 1970s. This really looked at the southern part of the Gulf and how you had rebellious movements in Oman, next door in Yemen also, trying to unseat British-backed rulers. He really foresaw miserable tribes trying to overthrow their Western-backed puppets. In parallel to that, we had bodies of scholarship subscribing to modernisation theory, especially in the United States, arguing that most parts of the developing world, and including the Middle East, certainly the Gulf states, which were on the cusp of great wealth afforded by the oil and gas booms, this would inevitably lead to powerful modernising forces impacting on these traditional societies, urbanisation, telecommunications, education, foreign travel, etc. This would inevitably lead to new classes forming, we can call them a middle class, a modern class of bourgeoisie, whatever else, but they'd be unwilling to live by traditional rules for much longer. Samuel Huntington's King's Dilemma chapter in his book Political Order in Changing Societies always resonates with this, essentially arguing that any traditional leader, such as a Gulf Sheikh or Sultan or Emir, would be faced with an almost impossible dilemma. On the one hand, he could allow this modernisation to take place, in our case, use the oil wealth, spend it on the schools and the universities and the health service. That would lead to a population that would eventually want to eat up the ruler. On the other hand, if the ruler tried to block those modernising forces, literally sweeping them under the mattress, as was the case with one of the rulers of Abu Dhabi in the late 1960s, that would lead to a population that would become increasingly restive and again would seek to unseat their ruler. So we had these two bodies of scholarship really arguing that the change in the region would come from one direction or another. As we've seen 40, 50 years later, that hasn't really been the case. My main argument is that's really because we haven't had either a proletariat form in the region nor a bourgeoisie either. We've had the oil wealth and the gas wealth more recently being very effectively channeled by governments back sufficiently to a sufficient number of their citizenry, essentially setting up distributive states that don't rely on extracting wealth from citizens, so there isn't a tax culture in the region. We have the free housing, the various benefits, the welfare states, literally cradle-to-grave welfareism. We have, of course, the public sector employment that for many years was guaranteed to young Gulf nationals if they finish high school or finish university. In that sense, we essentially had almost all Gulf nationals not really being part of a working class because the state was providing wealth to them. We also had no real middle class form either, despite people going to university, seeking qualifications. We have the state controlling, preventing civil society from forming, free speech very much frowned on. If money is in people's pockets, if jobs are guaranteed, if the welfare state is all provided for you, it's very unlikely you will rock the boat. And if dissidents do try and rock the boat, the rulers can bank on a very substantial silent majority that prefer the status quo and will not allow the dissidents to gather any traction. So this distribution of wealth has been a very important explanation for the survival of Gulf monarchies up until the past few years. But there's far more to it than just distributing wealth. After all, some of the Gulf states are not really blessed with that much resources. Bahrain's oil and gas industry is barely ticking over. We have in Saudi Arabia a substantial population of nationals, many millions. Thus, the wealth has to be distributed quite thinly compared to some of the other Gulf states. So there's been much more than just wealth. There's been quite a dynamic ruling bargain or social contract in place in many of these states. Unwritten and unspoken, but nonetheless the bulk of the citizenry are well aware of this, essentially understanding that there's this deal in place, the distribution of sufficient oil rents to the population in exchange for political acquiescence. Tack on a few of the components too: religious legitimacy of the rulers, mosque building, controlling religion, co-opting religion in most of these states, co-opting culture and history, a massive museum building program over the past few decades, creating a narrative about the history of these states with the ruling families very much at the centre of that. Often the period of British protection is very much airbrushed over. I remember teaching at a university in the United Arab Emirates where many of my students, all of whom were citizens, genuinely believed that their forefathers had fought some kind of war of independence in the late 1960s to remove their British governors. That couldn't be further from the truth. The sheikhs of their country were actually offering the British government money to keep British forces deployed in the region. So we've had religion used, culture used. In some cases, even rulers have attempted to garner environmental resources too, legitimacy resources, by championing their support of the environment, recycling, green energy, etc. That may sound ironic, but it's created very good winning headlines for many of these rulers. We've also had cults of personality be taken to an incredible level in the Gulf states, where some rulers, the ruler of Dubai always comes to my mind, has essentially portrayed himself as a superman to his citizens. Here we have a champion horse rider, a politician, of course, also an acclaimed poet. Essentially, he is the ultimate celebrity for the population. One of the first heads of state to actually have a website many years ago, has his own Twitter feed, Facebook group. You get the picture. We have a celebrity status here forming around the rulers. But what about this large population in the Gulf that are not citizens and can never be citizens? How do they factor into this? These millions of expatriates that in many cases have built and run these countries. Well, they essentially are part of the deal too. In most cases, they never intend to settle and live and retire in these countries. They are paid more than they are in their home countries. As tragic as that may sound, they're often escaping far more miserable circumstances in their country of origin. They range from, of course, the South Asian labourers building many of the skyscrapers, to including the Western university professors, surgeons, doctors, consultants. All are essentially labour migrants and expatriates who have no intention of actually becoming citizens there. This allows the citizens to form, courtesy of their birthright as a citizen, part of a natural social elite. So as well as all the economic opportunities provided to citizens by the oil state, we also have the social stratification between expatriates and citizens. If after all you're a citizen and you're well aware that the majority of the population living in the country are very much guest workers, this again makes you thankful to the leadership, thankful to the rulers, and again contributes to this political acquiescence. I was also asked by RTS to touch upon some of the external strategies of the Gulf monarchies. Of course, they've had to survive in a very dangerous neighbourhood. The threat of invasion looming at all times. Kuwait, of course, is the worst nightmare for the Gulf states, having been invaded by neighbouring Iraq back in 1990 and only being liberated by essentially a Western-led force a year later in 1991. So what have they tried to do to guarantee their survival on an external level? Well, again, we've seen the wealth distribution figure very highly in this explanation, using oil rents to distribute to other parts of the region, especially more impoverished Arab and Muslim populations, ranging from East Africa, Palestine, of course, even Kosovo in Europe, where there's a substantial Muslim population, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the tsunami victims in East Asia and Indonesia. So essentially buying goodwill and influence with this soft power of charitable donations, official development aid, and so on. We've also, of course, had the guarantees of protection from the Western superpowers. A substantial chunk of GDP of all the Gulf monarchies has been handed over to Western military contractors over the past several decades. This now is at higher levels than ever before. We have countries like Oman, which are running low on oil and gas resources, still handing over 9 or 10% of their GDP in some years to Western arms suppliers. This connects very nicely with how many of the Gulf monarchies have dealt with any opposition they've faced in recent years. It's generally been a demonization. There always has to be a bogeyman. In the past, it's been Arab nationalists, communists, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood. Iran, of course, now features very highly too. Essentially allowing the Gulf monarchies to portray dissidents and opponents to their Western protectors as something very dangerous indeed. Moreover, providing the Western protectors with the ideal explanation for providing ever more expensive armaments to these countries in what's perceived to be a very dangerous region. We also have, very interestingly, the soft power resources that have been accumulated in the Western countries too. These are not just sovereign wealth funds that are buying stakes in blue chip companies in the West, which has been the case for so long, but also in investments that can never possibly turn a profit, buying headline-grabbing sports clubs, Manchester City, Emirates Stadium in Britain, Chrysler Building in New York, bought in just prior to the credit crunch, investing in British and American universities, buying influence and prestige wherever possible. So what may be going wrong despite all of these impressive ruling bargains, social contracts, and elaborate wealth distribution mechanisms, both at the domestic and the external level? Well, we do have a few things beginning to severely unsettle the Gulf rulers. We have what I like to describe as a pincer movement taking effect at the moment. We have, at the most basic level, a looming crisis over the level of subsidies and distributed wealth that these Gulf states are likely to be able to provide in the very near future. We have the IMF predicting that Saudi Arabia, for example, may go into a budget deficit in the next few years. They've been trying to spend their way through this Arab Spring, increasing the number of public sector jobs in Saudi Arabia. Ironically, in the Ministry of Interior has been one of the biggest new employers, introducing minimum wages in Oman, promises of jobs in all of the Gulf states, trying to really buy out the time, hoping that the Arab Spring will peter out and that Gulf monarchies will pull through this. But this is clearly unsustainable. The Gulf monarchies cannot keep spending at the rates they're currently spending. We have oil and gas resources almost depleted in half of the Gulf monarchies. Even in Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, these are far from infinite resources. We have vastly accelerating domestic energy consumption as well, which is fast eating into the ability of these countries to export. Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, already has a natural gas shortage. Saudi Arabia won't be far behind. So we have the economic component of the survival strategy being eaten away at. In parallel to this, we have the impact of the Arab Spring. Many will argue this is about solidarity, this is about young Gulf Arabs feeling they're not alone anymore. The people of Tunisia, Egypt, Syria are already fighting their autocrats. Why can't the Gulf Arab people do the same? I think there's certainly a case of that. There's certainly some demonstration effect taking place. But what I find more interesting is how the young Gulf Arab population are perhaps benefiting from some kind of super modernizing force. All the wealth that's been spent on the great infrastructure, the telecoms, the education, may actually be paying off for those modernization theorists I mentioned earlier this evening. Are these forces, such as the internet and social media, satellite TV, that can no longer be co-opted by regimes and states? If you think about all the earlier modernizing forces impacting on the Gulf monarchies, including even the early days of the internet, these could be used to a state's advantage. Email, sure, the regime can read your email. Websites, it can block websites it doesn't like. Meanwhile, the government and the ruling families can create websites of their own. But with social media and peer-to-peer networking and smartphones, it's becoming much harder. So we're finding ourselves in a situation where Facebook, Twitter, rapidly being increasingly frequently being described as the effective parliaments in many of these Gulf monarchies now, where people can vent their frustrations, can organise themselves, and the security services don't really know how to handle it. Predictably, we've seen a reaction to this. We've seen street protests mixed with cyber activism in Bahrain have led to a revolution of sorts back in early 2011. There was a heavy crackdown. This has petered on for the next year and a half, but the Bahrainis, like the Egyptians, are very unlikely to give up. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates even had to militarily intervene at one point to keep the Bahraini ruling family on the throne. In Kuwait, we've seen the Kuwaiti people already challenge their emir on several subjects. They're currently boycotting the latest parliament, describing it as a useless, loyalist talking shop. In Oman, the Sultan has been backed into a corner. He's had to promise 30,000 new jobs he can ill afford to create. Even in the United Arab Emirates, often regarded as a little oasis of relatively liberal state in the region, we have 94 political prisoners, all of whom are citizens, who were charged yesterday with trying to seize power from the state. Finally, what about Qatar, the home to Al Jazeera, which has supposedly been helping the Arab Spring and other parts of the region? Well, Al Jazeera, when it comes to its coverage of conditions and issues in the Gulf states, extremely lackluster coverage. Just try and find recordings and footage of the estimated 50,000 that took to the streets of Saudi Arabia last month after the killing of an 18-year-old by security services. Also, what about that well-known Qatari poet who was given a life sentence last month for insulting the emir? Well, I realise I've run out of time, but to sum it up, we have a new generation here in the region that are not only being impacted upon by these very powerful new modernising forces, but also they still have the same level of expectations as to what the state should be providing as it provided their fathers and grandfathers' generations. I've done the arithmetic as best I can in the book After the Sheikhs, and my conclusion is it doesn't add up anymore. Thank you.